This video will show you how to replace the power steering rack bellows boot on a Pontiac Grand Prix. This is part of the front steering and suspension located behind the front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. To gain access, let's safely raise and support and remove our front wheel. Just a quick note about doing this job, you will need a 4-wheel alignment once you're done. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, let's have a look along this area. This is where we can see our tie rod ends. We need to start at our jam nut. We'll be using a 22mm for our jam nut. When you go to loosen this, we want to be turning it clockwise. That's going to pull it out and away from the outer tie rod end. Once you have that broken free, we're making our way towards the outer side of the outer tie rod end for the mounting nut. On this outer tie rod end, we do have a castle nut and we have a locking cotter pin holding it in position. Remove the cotter pin. For this, I'm just using some cutters. Of course, we'll be replacing this. Never reuse those. Quick inspection of that, we'll set it aside for recycling. I'm using a 17mm for my mounting nut. Once you've removed that mounting nut, just start it back on a couple threads. To remove the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle, I'm going to be using a hammer. I'm going to lightly tap on my steering knuckle, causing vibration. Once this breaks free, we can remove the nut, remove the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. Now we can take hold of the inner tie rod end and the outer tie rod end. We're going to start turning this counterclockwise, unscrewing it from the inner tie rod end. Count the amount of turns it takes to remove it and take note of that. 1, 2, 3, and so on. There we are. I had 9. Your results may vary. Now let's prepare to remove our jam nut. To do that, you may find that the inner tie rod end stud spins on you. To help prevent that, I'm going to use some locking pliers. Just want to make sure this is nice and tight. You may have to use some heat or some penetrant on that jam nut. There's that. Just a quick inspection and we'll set it aside. We'll remove our locking pliers. Now let's make our way up towards where the bellows boot connects to our inner tie rod end. Looking in this area, you can see that we do have a squeezable clamp. I'm going to squeeze on the ears and pull that out of place. I'll just use some long nose pliers. There's our clamp. We'll set it aside. In that same area, I'm going to be using an angled pick. I want to try to break the bellows boot free from the inner tie rod end without causing any damage. Now once you have that broken free, we're heading inboard. Now continuing on, we're looking deep inside this area. We can see our power steering rack and you can see exactly where the power steering rack bellows boot connects onto it. There is a clamp, but up along the top here, you can see that there's a crossover tube. This tube leads from this bellows boot all the way over towards the other side of the vehicle. During the installation process, we need to make sure this tube is properly in place. Now let's continue on down along the bottom. Now let's go ahead and remove the clamp. That'll be done from down along the bottom of the bellows boot. So I'm just taking a long pry bar. I'm going up against this area of the clamp. Now on the far end, I'm going to tap on it with a hammer. I want to break this clamp free. Once you have it broken free, go ahead and remove it from the vehicle. Now we can take hold of that boot. We'll give it a gentle twist, pull it away from the power steering rack and that crossover tube. Okay, it's separated from the tube. There it is, friend. Just a quick inspection of that and we'll set it aside. Now let's get ready to install the power steering rack bellows boot. The first thing I always like to do is take a wire tie. I have it already made into a loop. I'm going to bring it around the larger circular port. This is the area that goes along the power steering rack. Now as we slide this in, this area will sit on the power steering rack, and this is for the crossover tube. Let's get this in position. We're sliding it all the way down the inner tie rod end towards the power steering rack. Now as I make my way into this area, I'm focusing on installing that around the power steering rack, but I also need to align my tube with the proper port on the boot. You can see that right along here. This can be fairly difficult, just takes a little bit of patience. Line it up, press it on there. So I'm pressing it onto the tube, I'm making sure that it's secured. Now I'm going to go around the entire power steering rack bellows boot, confirm that that's fully up against the power steering rack as well. Now, since I am using a wire tie, I'm going to make sure the wire tie is nice and tight, holding this in position and trim off any excess. Double check to make sure the boot's properly secured in place to the power steering rack, the crossover tube's in place as well. Then we'll continue on with the outer clamp next. As far as the outer clamp, you can either reuse your original clamp or you can use a wire tie. It really just depends on the condition of that clamp. Sliding it onto the boot as far as possible. Confirming the boot is secured to the inner tie rod end. This feels good. After installing that power steering rack bellows boot, let's use some anti-seize on the threaded portion of the inner tie rod end. Now it's time to install our jam nut. Let's bring that all the way up into the anti-seize. Let's apply some anti-seize on this area of the inner tie rod end, right along the threads. Now we can install our new outer tie rod end. Now when we start on the outer tie rod end, we need to install it the same amount of turns it took to remove it in the first place. My application was 9. That's how many turns I'm going to install this. Your results may vary. Now we'll align the outer tie rod end with our steering knuckle. The stud goes straight down. On the bottom side of the steering knuckle, where the stud is, let's install a washer. And now I have my castle nut. When we go to tighten this, we're going to bottom it out. The torque for this is 34 foot-pounds. After you've torqued this to 34 foot-pounds, the next thing we have to do is pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the port on the tie rod stud. We need to install our locking cotter pin. If you do not have a slot aligned with the port, continue tightening until the very next slot is. After that, install your locking cotter pin. I have my cotter pin. I like to use cutters to pin this over. Just helps me grip onto it easiest. Take hold of the tie rod end, confirm it's secured to the steering knuckle. Now let's make our way back to that jam nut. Now I'm turning the jam nut counterclockwise up against my outer tie rod end. I'm using my wrench to make sure it's nice and tight. After confirming that that is tight, let's make sure we level off our outer tie rod end. Nice. Let's reinstall our wheel. Start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. Once you have them all started on, snug them up. We'll get the wheel back on the ground and then torque each lug nut to 100 foot-pounds. Now that I have the wheel back on the ground, I'm going to be torquing each one of my lug nuts to that 100 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay friend, we finished our installation. Now the next thing you have to do is take your vehicle for a road test. You're going to listen for any odd noises and get yourself a 4-wheel alignment. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.